Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Theology Thursday. How you going, Dave?
Yeah,
how's the leg?
A bit sore, but
Yeah, it is a bit
we
sore.
make it.
Old Dave in his wheelchair. It's good to have you back, and I hope you enjoyed the spiel on Halloween last week. If you didn't catch it, go back and check it out. We had a bit of feedback on it, which was really interesting. Thank you for being involved and getting engaged in what we're doing here, because Dave and I are really committed to good theology, not just what we read on or see on social media. Like we've been and we've to college, we've studied, we know what we're doing, and so I couldn't resist actually in church on Sunday. I had to say, a lot of people, there's a lot of fear going around with governments, changing and putting rules in around the COVID thing.
And there's reasons for it too.
Yeah, but some people, some well-meaning, I'm sure, Christians, they're saying, all this could be the end times. And we've talked about this before, Dave.
Yeah, we have. But at the moment, it looks like we've got some freedoms starting to come. Maybe masks we don't have to wear anymore. But there's still
freedoms. That doesn't sound very beast-like, does it?
There's still a bit of inconvenience around the COVID crisis.
Yeah.
But look, there's a lot of misinformation and partial information that's been spread during this pandemic. So I mean things like only getting one side of the story to create an alarmist reaction.
Well, for example, in church on Sunday, I mentioned that the beast, if you haven't read it in the book of Revelation, John refers to a beast with 10 heads. And a lot of people think, and they've only ever heard, that this beast refers to a coalition of nations, a one world government with 10 nations, and they're going to try to control the whole world. But I did quickly explain on Sunday that no, actually the beast is the Roman Empire, and the 10 heads are the 10 Caesars. And so, I think it's partial information, like you're saying. People are only getting part of the story.
And we're getting that, say, with things like the AZ vaccine, saying, you'll get clots if you have the AZ. But the people telling the story don't actually mention that other drugs can cause clots.
It's not the whole truth.
It's not. There's more serious reactions reported from all sort of drugs like aspirin, for example.
Yeah.
You've got a better chance of getting a clot from aspirin than AZ. And for the ladies, the pill. So
I've heard that. Yeah.
Partial truth is not a complete picture. Therefore, it's not the real or the whole truth.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this misinformation that's being spread on social media is being spread by people who really don't know the facts. They're simply repeating what somebody else has said, and because it broadly fits into the circumstances, it seems to be true. I would have been guilty of that. I was brought up, my first Bible college, they only taught one eschatological view, or one view of end times.
I was going to say, just explain to people what eschatology is.
Eschatology is the study of end times.
The end of the world, Jesus coming again.
And we're only taught one, so that's what you repeat, because that's what you've been taught.
But how did you feel when you found out that you were being kept in the dark somewhat, only told one theory, and that there's this other theory that has been around for a lot longer and a lot more scholars.
As soon as you start to study, when you look at theology properly, you always get a range. And as soon as you start to say, because I had questions anyway, there were things that didn't make sense to me. But in most cases, people who spread this sort of stuff, it's not because of their own research, but simply it's a repetition of information, or maybe even misinformation. But when it's repeated often enough, then people say, we've heard this from so many different sources.
Yeah, but they're only hearing the same thing repeated, right? Over and over.
It gets a life of its own, and it becomes the fact, or becomes truth.
And to be honest, Dave, up until recently, it hasn't really concerned me. I mean, I don't know if it's concerned you much, but look, people have their crazy theories about the one world government and all this sort of nonsense that goes on. But recently we've seen that it's actually starting to create a lot of fear, and it's become very important. So more recently, that's why we've decided here on Theology Thursday to go back and look at some of this stuff to dispel fear, to get, like, you don't have to be afraid. It's actually fairly optimistic what the Bible says about these days.
Even though they're talking about AZ, or should you get the Pfizer or whatever, it's a lot of that is actually coming from a theological, not a medical base. So it's actually about theological issues, and a lot of people don't really understand that. Like many things on social media, some of the theological statements are repeated so often that they become truth to a lot of people. So, for example, okay, let's take an example. People say the stage is set for the rapture because so many have fallen away from their Christian faith and governments are becoming totalitarian. Well, there's some factual information in there, but it's not really truth.
No.
There's some facts, but those facts confuse the truth. So is there a falling away from the Christian faith?
In some countries.
Well, I think in some countries there's a falling away from church attendance. I'm not sure anything about the Christian faith.
Point. But they're mostly Western churches.
Or Western churches.
There's a falling away, certainly. Not as many people go to church in Australia as they maybe used to in the 50s, or in the United States or England.
And if we judge by church attendance in the Western world, well, we can say, yes, it's true. But we can't make a universal truth based on a few Western countries, because there's massive revival happening around the world. Africa, South America, the Middle East.
Millions of people becoming Christians.
It's amazing. Even this week, I was just reading about a church in Venezuela. This is one church, not just a whole country. This is one church where they had a baptismal service just last week. Baptized 5,000 people.
That's a good thing.
The church triumphant is alive and well.
Right.
So across the globe, no, the church is not in decline. So our government's becoming totalitarian.
Well, newsflash, there's always been a totalitarian government. Like the Roman Empire, the British Empire. Democracy is a fairly new concept. Thank you, America, for coming up with that one. But
the Roman Empire was certainly totalitarian. But here's another little newsflash. Even though it was, the globe is still spinning now. Even though they ruled the world a long time ago. But I think the reason most people get hung on this stuff is probably because fear takes hold of them, and fear drives them to believe all, or at least most of the scenarios that we read on social media mainly. And the other reason is that a lot of people from the Western non-reformist evangelical churches, so that's things like the Baptist, Pentecostals, Brethren Church, they've only been taught this model of
the Darby
model about
it's all we've been exposed
end
to.
times, and some of the misinformation about COVID fits into that model of end times, and so. Hey,
so it's a vicious cycle, isn't it? It feeds itself. You have this fear mongering, this and
it has
negative, vision of the future, and then these things.
And people say, well, obviously that's what Christians believe. So, and it comes a bit of a shock when they find out that this particular view of end times, with a secret rapture of the church getting out for a few years, and a great tribulation for 7 years, it's not actually shared by everyone. No. Those who come from a reformist tradition, Anglicans, you come from an Anglican background, Presbyterians, for example, they have a totally different view. And the doctrine that Darby proposed is not the model that was believed and taught in the church for the last 2,000 years. And in fact, it was started by a Jesuit priest in the Reformation. We won't go there, but it's certainly not something that has been right out the front.
So we here at Theology Thursday want to allay your fears and expose you to some theology that it may be new to you if you were from one of those non-reformist churches, or if you've only ever heard the Darby model, and I think you're going to love it. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. Well,
one of the big areas of fear and debate is centered around a 7-year tribulation period.
The tribulation.
in the end times.
Where does that come from? Where do they've obviously read that in the Bible somewhere. This tribulation, it's going to be hard, bad times. Tribulation means bad times just before Jesus returns.
They say that it's going to be the establishment of one world government, a dictatorship, extreme persecution of anyone who wants to follow God. And then some believe that a rapture is going to occur at the beginning of the 70th week and beginning of the 7 years and take the church out. Others believe, no, halfway through, 3.5 years through, it then goes out. They call it the mid-tribulation. And others say, no, the saints will go all the way through the Great Tribulation. Do you know, there are some, I was saying this to somebody on Sunday when we were talking about this, there are some that have up to 9 raptures happening during the 7-year period. Truly.
So this is what you were referring to before when you say there's, partial truths, and people, we've always done that with everything. We're doing it with COVID, we're doing it with this, we're doing that. We do it with theology. There's partial truths.
And most of it comes out of Daniel.
Well, that's right. I was going to say
2 and 9.
The tribulation idea is really
and Matthew 24.
Yeah, it's a combination of Matthew 24, what Jesus said in Matthew 24 about this horrible time, and Daniel, and people have put the two together and thought, this is going to happen here and there. So, do you think it'd be a good idea just to quickly refer to some of that?
Because Daniel, maybe just have a quick look at it, because Daniel had interpreted a dream for Nebuchadnezzar about a big statue, and then later Daniel had a visit from Gabriel, who told him about a period of 70 weeks. So maybe...
Okay, so this is what it says. We're in Daniel chapter 2, and it's referring to this statue. The king had this amazing vision, and Daniel tells him what he saw, which was a miracle to even know what he saw in his own private dream, and then told him, here it is. He says, "You looked, O king," so we're in verse 31, "and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling one, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of gold, its chest and arms were silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands." That's referring to Jesus. "It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain that filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and here's what it means. You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory in your hands. He has placed mankind, beasts of the field, birds of the air, wherever you live, etc., etc. You are the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. That would be the Persian kingdom that was next to come along. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. That's the Greeks. The Alexander the Great ruled over the whole earth. And finally, everybody say it together, finally, this is the last one, not the second last, but the final one. There will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. He's referring to the Roman Empire. For iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all others. Just as you saw the feet and toes were partly of baked clay, partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, and it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this, the Roman Empire, this kingdom, will also be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. And in that time, the time of those kings, the Roman Empire times, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another kingdom. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it will itself endure forever. Yeah. This is the meaning of the vision. So clearly he's referring to the establishment of the kingdom of God when Jesus came into the Roman Empire. So when people say, oh yes, that the iron legs might be the Roman Empire, but the feet, that's a different one. That's the European Union.
It can't be.
It's not. It's said, we just read it, the final kingdom is this one.
And the Roman kingdom, of course, had 10 toes, or we call them Caesars.
Yeah, 10 Caesars. Julius Caesar was the first.
Yeah.
There were the 10 main Caesars.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and he explains what the toes mean. He explains that the clay and the iron are not, that is the Roman Empire.
Yeah. So maybe let's have a look also at Daniel's other one, which was the 70 weeks, because people combine those two.
Right.
In order to get the
because this is the passage in Daniel 9 where people get the idea of a 7-year tribulation, and where they all speculate whether there's going to be a rapture at the beginning of it, in the middle of it. And this is the passage that speaks of that. And it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this in a minute. So we're in Daniel chapter 9, and Daniel's been praying. And the archangel Gabriel comes to him, and he says in verse 24, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgressions. I wonder what that means. 77s. And to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. No one understand this. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, that was by Cyrus, right?
Yep.
He decreed it to Ezra, the Ezra the priest. He said, you can go and rebuild Jerusalem. So from that time until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens. So that's one group of sevens, and then 62 sevens. And the anointed one will be, then where am I up to? There it is. And it will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, and in times of trouble. After 62 sevens, so you've got the 1 7, the 7 sevens, and now the 62 sevens, that would equal 69 sevens. So after 69 altogether, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Oh, that actually happened. And the end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm, that's God will confirm, a covenant with many for 1 7, but in the middle of that 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Is that God, or is that Caesar? Oh, no, that might not be God. That could be Titus. Who knows? And the one who causes desolation will place abominations in a wing, or on a wing of the temple, until the end that is decreed has been poured out on him. So, Dave, what are we looking at here?
So each of those 70 weeks, or each of those 70s, are regarded as 70 weeks of 7.
So, okay, so you had, first of all, there was 7 sevens, then 62 sevens, and then one final 7.
Yep.
That equals 77s. Or so what's a 7?
Well, that's 7 years for each of those. So
are you just making that up, or just all the scholars agree?
everybody agrees on that.
Leading question there.
Starting from 457 BC, which is where that 70 weeks start, because that we know where it started, because
that was the year that Cyrus
Gabriel gave the game away there by saying this is when it's going to start.
So Cyrus says to Ezra, you can rebuild. So King Cyrus was a Persian king, and he had just defeated the Babylonians. So a little quick bit of history. The Babylonians, 70 years before that, they destroyed Jerusalem, and they took all the people, not all, they took a lot of the people back to Babylon. And then next minute, here comes Persia, their neighbor, which is modern-day Iran, and Babylon is modern-day Iraq. So Persia conquered Iran and said, you can all go back to Jerusalem now. So that was the decree. From that decree, he's saying there's going to be one group of 7 sevens, which is 49 years. Then the next is 62 sevens.
And that 49 years, firstly, that's going to come out of Leviticus.
Leviticus 25, when God talks about the year of Jubilee. Yes. So go back and read that. Leviticus 25 from verse 8 and following, and Daniel would have understood that well. He would have said, as soon as Gabriel said there'll be 7 sevens, 49, that's what he's talking about. At the beginning of the 50th year, blast the trumpet on the Day of Atonement. It's going to be a year of Jubilee. It's going to be, freedom's coming.
And
so that's what Gabriel was referring to. Daniel would have understood that.
And so if we count these, and pretty much all theologians agree on this. There's really no dispute.
Even the Darby'ists, right?
Yeah, everybody agrees on this. That we count forward from there, and we go 69 weeks. That's 483 years. That takes us up to around 27 AD, which is about the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So from the decree through to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, there is 69 weeks.
Yeah. Just to be clear, a week, according to all scholars agree that a week refers to actually 7 years, not 7 days. So this is their prophetic way of speaking.
So that brings us to the 70th week, the last 7.
So hold on, you're telling me that 49 years plus 434 years actually brings us to the same year that Jesus started his ministry. So you're talking nearly 500 years.
And just about every theologian agrees on that. Certainly all the evangelicals and even a lot of us. So this brings us to this 7 years. And this is the one that's in dispute.
Right.
And it maybe gets a little weird depending on your view.
Because he says after that 69th, so 7 times 7, and 62 times 7, then in the 70th week, the last one.
Each of those up to 69, each one of those weeks followed one after the other.
Correct.
Right. But now when we get to the 69th week, Darby says, okay, we're going to take a little bit of a break here. The 70th week actually doesn't happen after the 69th. Instead, there's a big gap that's going in there. We don't know how long that gap is going to be.
Wow.
And that gap takes us up to when Christ returns and takes the church away. And then the 70th week starts, and it's a 7-year tribulation period. So the gap goes from the time of Christ's first coming to the time of his second coming, and then Daniel's vision picks up again. That gap is inserted in order to comply with Darby's dispensational model.
Right. You got to really do some theological acrobatics to make it fit, don't you? You know,
you do.
It's a 2,000-year gap.
And
Hang on a minute.
By dispensational, what we mean there, it's a model that Darby invented that divides human history into some theological dispensations.
Well, what are they?
There's the dispensation of innocence, which was Eden.
The Garden of Eden.
Then conscience, which is fall and the flood.
Right.
Human government, which is flood to Abraham. And then the dispensation of promise, that goes from Abraham to Moses. Then the dispensation of the law, which goes Moses to Jesus. And then the dispensation of grace, which goes from Jesus to the end of the gap.
Right.
According to...
Right.
And in order to accommodate that last dispensation and still have part of Daniel's 70th week in operation, there has to be a break in the continuity.
Yeah.
The 70 weeks are suspended. And so we're kind of itching for this last one to start.
And look, it has to be said that Darby's noted that there are these sort of chunks of history, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. It's this last bit that I'm having issues with, because he really had to do some, as I said, theological acrobatics to make it fit, and it doesn't fit, especially when Dave explains to you in a minute what it really means.
The interesting thing is that neither the Bible writers, the prophets, Daniel himself, for example, even Jesus, none of them ever refer to this gap when they speak about end time. So maybe they didn't know about it. That makes no sense to me. If Daniel's 490 years or 70 weeks are actually 2,490 plus a few,
hang on a minute. Nobody talks about that.
How come there's nothing mentioned about that in Scripture? How come the early church expected the end times to happen in their day, not 2,000 years down the track? How come John taught the church of his day? He said, hey, we're living not only in the last days, and he referred to us living in the last days when he was alive, but he wrote to people, and he referred to himself as their brother in the Great Tribulation. So
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned this before, Dave. Are we in the last days? Well, yes, of course we are. We've been in the last days for 2,000 years.
Yep.
Is there a tribulation? Yes, there. Maybe not on the Sunshine Coast of Australia, where we're coming to you from, but there certainly is tribulation.
Try the Middle East.
In the Middle East, in China, and in Northern Africa, and other places.
Historically, there has been.
There's always been tribulation.
The church has always been persecuted. There has not been a time in human history, or at least since the establishment of the church, where the church was not persecuted in one form or another in some parts of the world.
So yes, there's tribulation, and yes, we're in the last days. But when did they start? A couple of thousand years ago, when Jesus, was crucified, and then subsequently 40 years later,
we'll get there. Logically and mathematically, and in all of the other biblical passages, there's nothing between 69 and 70. So if this number 70 is the same as all others and follows on from 69, it would surely make more sense. They say, well, in fact, we know in Daniel's prophecy, the 70th week is divided into two halves.
Right.
3.5 years, 3.5 years.
Yeah, we just read that.
We just read that. And we also just read that in the middle of that 70 or 70th week, in that 7 years, Messiah is going to suddenly be cut off.
The anointed one.
But not for his own sake.
That sounds just like Jesus.
That sounds a lot like
he was cut off 3.5 years after the beginning of his ministry. So we're taking 69 weeks, or that is 490, what is it? No. 400, you know what I mean? Like 69 sevens to the beginning of his ministry. Then this last 7-year period, you've got the beginning, which is that way, and then halfway, the Messiah, the anointed one, is cut off.
Cut off, yep.
That is what happened.
And
Jesus was
exactly
crucified.
What happened. He was cut
3.5 years after he started.
You can't be cut off any more certainly than a cross. So he was certainly cut off, and not for himself. He died for us. He paid the price for us, not for himself. And that would take us to the end of Jesus' ministry and the crucifixion. So Messiah suddenly being cut off is being executed, not for himself, for the sins of the world. And this period, according to Daniel, would be the means of finishing transgression, ending sin, atoning for iniquity, ushering in everlasting righteousness. And that's what Jesus did.
You see that?
He atoned for sin. He's finished our sin. Our sin is gone. Because 100%. Jesus finished it at the cross. And we have the righteousness. I get excited about this because we have the righteousness of God. And that is everlasting righteousness. And guess who ushered that in? Messiah, when he was cut off in the midst of the 70th week. It's what Jesus did. Why do we want to take that away? Interestingly, this term cut off is a phrase used both for dead and for ratifying a covenant. So by cutting off, it's going to be for the benefit of others, not himself. And it will confirm the covenant to many, which is what we read. So the covenant of grace is revealed through the covenants with Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, as further prophesied by Jeremiah, are going to be fulfilled by the Messiah. In the middle of the 70th seven, Messiah will cause the whole temple worship to cease, to be rendered unnecessary. And how did he do this? When he died, guess what happened to the curtain?
It was torn in two from top to bottom.
So the sacrificial system really ended there. Even though they stitched it up again and kept sacrificing for a while, the system was over.
In particular, the system from God's perspective, who's God has sent Gabriel, his angel, to explain this, that even though, yes, for the next 40 years until the Romans came along and destroyed the temple, which we're going to talk about in just a second, even though that happened, and they technically kept sacrificing for 40 more years, God wasn't interested anymore. God had said, I want you to sacrifice animals. Now he says, I don't want you to. It's over. Jesus is
interestingly, when I was doing some of my studies years and years ago, I was studying under a rabbi in Sydney. And on the Passover plate these days, you have the shank bone of a lamb.
Who doesn't love a lamb shank?
Yeah, a lamb shank sitting right there. And that's to represent the sacrificial lamb. And he explained to me that we don't have the temple anymore, so we can't sacrifice the lamb. So we have the shank bone, an unbroken shank bone, as a reminder of sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I said, how long has this been the practice? And he said, well, certainly since Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. He said, but in fact, some poor families actually had started doing this long before that.
Wow.
I said, how long before that? He said, 30 or 40 years. I'm going,
that's when Jesus was crucified.
So historically, there's so much that points us immediately to that. So the temple worship really was brought to an end. Its validity was brought to an end, let's put it that way. And then we come to the second half of the 70th week.
So what we're saying, though, is therefore when people try to draw the conclusion that there's this 3.5 years and then there'll be a rapture that Paul talks about in Thessalonians in the middle of 3, that's not what this is referring to at all. This is referring to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus himself. And I think to try to replace that with anything else is just
so short.
Crazy, and it's not okay. Let's not do that.
In the second half of the 70th week, it's supposed to go till the time of the Gentiles.
Right.
Now, interestingly, Jesus said to his disciples to go into the whole world and take the gospel to all people. But for the first 3.5 years, guess what? They only went to Israel. And then came the time of the Gentiles, and the gospel then began its global journey.
So the end of that 7-year period, so you've got Jesus being crucified and resurrected in the middle of it, and then another 3.5 years passes before
the time of the Gentiles
Acts 8:1.
Yep.
You know, when the gospel goes to
so
nations.
It was fully established, and as prophesied in Nebuchadnezzar's statue, this stone not made of human hands. Some say it's Jesus, some say the church, but really those two belong together. You can't separate Jesus and the church. So whichever it was, smashed into the Roman Empire, the feet of iron and clay, conquered it, because actually Christianity did conquer the Roman Empire. Take Constantine, he made sure of that. And it began to grow until it covered the whole world. And that's the history of the church. It's grown and grown and grown. It started off not as a rock made of human hands.
And we read it before, it will endure forever.
And it never, ever going to...
Which is why I said earlier, we have a very optimistic view of the end times. We have a very optimistic view of the world before Christ returns.
And interestingly, the Darby model says that the church has to be in decline. Remember, we said that at the beginning, how they're looking for the church to be shrinking. But God said of its increase, speaking of the kingdom, and speaking of Christ, of the increase, there will be no end. So the church is continually growing, not shrinking, but growing. There's no falling away of the church. It's growing in bands of revival right across the globe today. So look, there's no time gap specified before the 70th week, but Darby and Co.'s views required a gap of 1,000 years, and that sort of passing of time has no textual warrant.
No.
So the next thing that Daniel then goes on to talk about concerning Jerusalem and the temple is that the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the sanctuary. Now, the Darbyists try and say, well, that's the Antichrist in the end time. However, interestingly, the prince which was to come, I wonder if it could be this particular prince. He was actually, when Jerusalem was sacked by Rome, when it was laid siege and then sacked, it wasn't under one of the generals, nor under one of the Caesars. It was Titus, who was the prince of Rome. He sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 70 AD.
And that's again what Daniel prophesies.
Exactly,
is that he will destroy Jerusalem. So at the beginning of the 70 weeks, Jerusalem's rebuilt, and at the end,
it's
destroyed.
And Jesus, actually, in Matthew 24, which we mentioned a moment ago, prophesied the temple's destruction and said, this generation, so it's a contemporary thing, this generation will see it all happen. And it did.
And it did, yeah.
Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, which meant its desolation had come near. Gabriel's word were fulfilled in AD 70. The century's end came like a flood, with war to the end, for God had already decreed its desolation. So the imagery with a flood pictures the total destruction that was part of Roman's victory.
It was incredible. And Jesus said in Matthew 24, there will never be another day like it. And technically, like there was 1.3 million people were executed.
Second biggest Holocaust.
Yes, but really the other ones, there's actually Mao Zedong, with like 78 million people that died, but that was over years. A lot of starvation, still horrific. Stalin and Hitler were equal on 12 million. So technically, you could say those were bigger, but again, they were over years and years of systematic starvation and things. This is number 4. This is, in terms of numbers, 1.3 million is more than Rwanda. It's more than any other genocide. But it happened in such a short period of time, the siege of Jerusalem. So really, Jesus was accurate when he said there will never be another day like it.
And Josephus, Flavius Josephus, who was an historian, he was actually the negotiator because he was both Jewish and Roman.
Yeah.
He had a Jewish mother and a Roman father. So he was actually the negotiator that Rome used in dealing. So he got inside to see what was happening inside the walls.
Yeah.
As well as what was happening outside the walls.
So it's a very accurate
and
historical...
when he wrote his history, he could talk about... And the stuff that he said that was going on inside the walls, man, it's shocking.
Yeah.
But it reads... when you read Josephus, it's like reading the Bible, talking about rivers of blood. He said there was so much blood that it was actually putting out fires.
Wow.
Just unbelievable.
So sad.
Yeah. I won't go.
Yeah.
We could read Josephus. That'd be an interesting read. Yep.
So there you go.
So that's something maybe...
That was interesting. For those of you who weren't aware of the Daniel prophecies, now you do, and they were actually referring to Jesus, not some one world government down the track, and not the rapture. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if it is the first time and you're still trying to get your head around it, please do your own research, study. Just don't only listen to Darbyists who will try to make these scriptures fit with their particular point of view. I respect them, as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, but what we're teaching you here on Theology Thursday is traditional eschatology. It's what the church has taught for 2,000 years.
And if you want further information, come and talk to either Peter or I. And one of the things we can do is give you a link to an online book to read that you've got the hard copy. And that book is really, really good in the way it explains this. I mean, there's tons of others. Any Reformed theology textbook is going to deal with this in the same way, but this particular book just puts it nicely.
So God bless you. There's more to come. We'll come back to this again, probably next week.
Yeah, we want to look next week at as it was in the days of Noah.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what were the days of Noah really like, and did certain things happen? There's a few stories floating around that we want to talk about.
So that'll be interesting. So we might stay on the topic for a while just to help you get your head around it. But meanwhile, have a great week and God bless you.
Bless you now.